My daughter-in-law always made me tea, until I found out that she was slowing poisoning me. If you are watching this video, don't forget to like, share, and comment where you're watching from. My name is Dorothy Brennan. I'm 68 years old, and I built something from nothing. 40 years ago, my late husband George and I started a medical supply distribution company in our garage. We worked 18-hour days and bet everything on a business model everyone said would fail. They were wrong. By the time George died 3 years ago, the company had 18 warehouses and annual revenues of $47 million. We employed over 300 people and owned this Victorian house on Maple Street outright, along with investments that would last 3 lifetimes. George handled operations while I handled contracts and logistics. Together, we were unstoppable. Then his heart stopped on a Tuesday morning while reading the newspaper. No warning, no goodbye, just gone. For 3 years after George died, I threw myself into work, staying on as majority owner and board chair. But the house felt like a mausoleum. I'd sit surrounded by 40 years of memories and feel like I was drowning. The silence became unbearable. My son Trevor called every Sunday. He's a financial analyst, smart and ambitious, always in expensive suits. After his father passed, he visited more often, asking about the company, my estate planning, my succession strategy. He kept telling me I needed to think about the future, that I wouldn't run the company forever. I told him I had everything under control. I didn't know he was already planning my exit. 2 years after George's death, Trevor called asking if he could bring someone to Sunday dinner. He said her name was Cassidy and that she was special. I was thrilled. Trevor had never wanted me to meet anyone before. I spent Saturday preparing George's famous pot roast, setting out our good china, opening wine from our cellar. I wanted to make a good impression on this woman who'd captured my son's heart. When they arrived, I opened the door to my tall son and a petite blonde woman with perfect posture and a professionally practiced smile. She stepped forward and took both my hands, looking directly into my eyes with rehearsed intensity. She told me she'd been nervous to meet me, that Trevor talked about me constantly, about everything I'd built. Everything I'd built. Not how wonderful I was or how much he loved me. She'd gone straight to my accomplishments, my assets. I should have noticed that, but I didn't. Over dinner, Cassidy was flawless. She asked intelligent questions about the company and listened attentively to my stories about how George and I had started from nothing. She complimented everything from the pot roast to the house to the wine. She told me she was a freelance graphic designer who'd grown up in Florida. Her parents had passed away young and left her with nothing but debt. She said she'd always admired people who build things, who create real wealth and legacy. Her eyes moved around our dining room, lingering on the chandelier, the antique sideboard, the oil painting George bought me for our 20th anniversary. By evening's end, I felt something I hadn't felt in 3 years. Hope. Trevor called the next morning asking what I thought of her. I told him she was lovely, and he said he was going to marry her and wanted my blessing. 6 months later, they married at the Botanical Gardens. I cried during the vows, happy tears, I thought. Looking back now, I wonder if my body already knew what my mind refused to see. When they returned from their Bahamas honeymoon, Cassidy made a suggestion over coffee in my kitchen. Trevor had conveniently stepped out for a work call. She said she'd been thinking about me in this big house all alone, that it must be exhausting managing everything. She proposed that she and Trevor move in temporarily while they looked for their own place. She could help with everything: cooking, managing the household, organizing my schedule. She said it would give her a chance to learn from me about business, about building something that lasts. My chest warmed at the thought of this young woman wanting to learn from me, wanting to be close to me. She added casually that Trevor could help me more with company decisions, since he'd been worried about me carrying so much alone. I told her I'd love to have them both there. Her smile widened as she promised to take such good care of me. They moved in 2 weeks later. Cassidy transformed the house overnight, cooking elaborate meals and reorganizing everything with military precision. She insisted on handling all household management, telling me to focus on the important things while she handled the rest. It felt good to be cared for after 3 years of managing everything alone. But more than anything, Cassidy made me tea. Every afternoon at exactly 3 o'clock, she'd appear with my porcelain teacup on a silver tray, honey and lemon perfectly steeped. She'd smile that practiced smile and tell me to drink it while it was hot. And I always did. Trevor would praise her constantly, saying she'd been so good for me that I seemed more relaxed and less stressed about the company. I was relaxed, and for the first time since George died, I felt like I had family around me again. For 3 months, I believed everything was perfect. Then one afternoon in late January, everything changed. I was sitting by the window when Cassidy brought my tea, but as I lifted the cup, I noticed something wrong. She was watching me, not with affection, but with clinical measuring focus, like someone watching an experiment. I lowered the cup and asked if something was wrong. Her expression shifted instantly as she laughed and said no. Then she mentioned that I'd been slowing down lately, getting more forgetful, that it was natural at my age. Your age, she said, like a death sentence. After she left, I sat with the cooling tea, feeling foolish and paranoid. Cassidy was family. She loved Trevor. She'd been nothing but kind to me. I lifted the cup and drank, and the tea tasted perfect, honey and lemon, just the way I liked it. But as I set the empty cup down, a thought crept in. Why did Cassidy always insist on making the tea herself? She never let me prepare it, never let the housekeeper touch it. If I tried, she'd gently take the kettle and tell me to relax, that she'd handle it. I pushed the thought away, but the next afternoon at 3 o'clock, when Cassidy brought my tea again, I hesitated. Just for a second, just long enough to wonder. It started small, a wave of dizziness when I stood up too quickly from my desk. A persistent nausea that settled in my stomach like a stone. Exhaustion so profound that climbing the stairs to my bedroom felt like scaling a mountain. At first, I blamed stress, then age, telling myself maybe Trevor was right about my body not being what it used to be. But deep down, in a place I wasn't ready to acknowledge, I knew something was wrong. My body was whispering warnings I refused to hear. Cassidy noticed, of course, because she always noticed everything. One morning when I stumbled in the hallway, she was there immediately, suggesting I see a doctor, but then adding that doctors would just run expensive tests and tell me it was age-related. She steered me toward the living room, offering to bring my tea, and her words made sense since I'd always been skeptical of unnecessary medical interventions. When I mentioned my symptoms to Trevor over dinner, he barely looked up from his phone, saying matter-of-factly that I was 68 and my body wasn't what it used to be. Cassidy nodded sympathetically, reaching over to pat my hand, agreeing that my body was probably telling me to slow down. They exchanged a look, quick and imperceptible, that I couldn't quite read but would replay in my mind 1,000 times later. Then Maxine showed up without calling first, pushing past me into the foyer and declaring I looked like death warmed over. Max and I had been neighbors for 30 years, and if anyone could see through my careful facade, it was her. She gripped my shoulders and told me not to try to tell her I was fine, that 2 months ago I'd hiked 3 miles without breaking a sweat, and now I could barely stand without wobbling. Her voice cracked when she insisted I needed to see a doctor that very day. I wanted to argue, but the terror in her face broke something open inside me, and I whispered that I'd make an appointment. Max pulled me into a fierce hug, saying I'd scared her. Dr. Patel ordered a full panel of blood work to rule out thyroid, liver, kidney, and vitamin deficiencies. I sat in the lab chair while a phlebotomist drew vial after vial of dark red blood, trying not to think about worst-case scenarios. The results came back 3 days later showing slightly elevated liver enzymes, but nothing alarming. Everything else normal. When I told Cassidy the results were normal, her smile came too quickly and too brightly, like someone who'd been holding their breath. She clasped her hands together, saying it was wonderful news, that she'd told me it was probably nothing. But her eyes flickered to Trevor at the kitchen table. Another one of those looks I couldn't decipher. She moved toward the kettle, offering to make me tea so I could celebrate, and there was an edge of eagerness in her voice that made my skin prickle. That evening, Cassidy brought me my tea as always, same delicate porcelain cup, same honey and lemon ritual. I lifted the cup and drank deeply, grateful for the warmth, but as I swallowed, I noticed the tea tasted different, slightly bitter and metallic underneath the sweetness. I paused mid-sip, frowning, and Cassidy asked immediately if everything was okay, watching me with that focused intensity. I said quickly that my taste buds were changing with age, and she relaxed, agreeing that was perfectly normal. I finished the tea and handed her the empty cup, thinking that when your body turns against you, you never think to blame the hands that feed you. That night around 2 a.m, it hit me like a freight train. I woke up violently nauseous, barely making it to the bathroom before I started vomiting, wave after wave, until there was nothing left but bile. My head spun and the tiles were cold against my knees as I tried to call out for help, but my voice came out as barely a whisper. Trevor and Cassidy's bedroom door was closed, and they couldn't hear me, or maybe they could and simply didn't come. Eventually, I collapsed on the bathroom floor, too weak to stand, and lay there until sunrise, replaying that bitter taste in my tea over and over in my mind. Maxine found me at dawn, still on the bathroom floor, and her face went white. She said we were going to the ER right then, and I didn't have the strength to argue. Max half carried me to her car, and I remember thinking how strange it was that neither Trevor nor Cassidy had heard me vomiting all night. The emergency room admitted me immediately for severe dehydration, dangerously low blood pressure, and symptoms consistent with acute poisoning. That word hung in the air, but the ER doctor said it could mean anything: food poisoning, medication interaction, contaminated water. Max stood beside my bed like a guard dog and demanded specialized toxicology screening, a full panel, saying she didn't care what it cost. Trevor called Cassidy within an hour, and she arrived 20 minutes later, rushing through the door looking like the picture of a concerned daughter-in-law. But when she reached my bedside, I saw something that made my blood freeze. Her eyes weren't filled with worry but were calculating, measuring, assessing whether this was a setback or a catastrophe. She took my hand, asking what happened, her fingers cold against mine. I whispered that I didn't know while watching her face carefully, and for just a fraction of a second I saw relief flicker across her features before concern settled back into place. They kept me in the hospital for 2 days of IV fluids and bland food, and something strange happened. I started feeling better. Not just stable, but actually better, with the fog in my head beginning to lift, the nausea receding, and my strength slowly returning. By the second day, I could walk to the bathroom without assistance, and the nurses commented on my remarkable recovery. But I noticed something else. They hadn't brought me tea. Not once. For the first time in 6 months, I'd gone more than 48 hours without my afternoon ritual, without Cassidy's honey and lemon tea. And I felt better, the correlation impossible to ignore, but my mind refused to make the connection. Not yet. The call came on my 3rd morning from Dr. Nicole Shepard, the toxicologist who analyzed my blood work. Her voice was grave and careful, like someone delivering a terminal diagnosis. She said they'd found traces of 2 substances in my system: ethylene glycol, which is antifreeze, and brodifacoum, a common rat poison. The room tilted, and I gripped the phone so hard my knuckles went white, barely managing to whisper a shocked question. Dr. Shepard confirmed the levels indicated chronic exposure over several months, stating clearly that someone had been poisoning me deliberately and methodically. She said gently she was certain, and had already contacted the police. My mind reeled, trying to process who would do this, who had access to my food and drinks, who wanted me dead. But even as I asked these questions, answers were already forming, too terrible to acknowledge. Cassidy cooked most of my food, but Trevor ate the same meals so she couldn't poison those without risking him. Then what was the one thing only I consumed? The one thing no one else touched? My hands started shaking as the answer crashed over me. The tea, the daily ritual, the one thing Cassidy insisted on preparing herself every single day at 3 o'clock without fail. I whispered to the empty room as realization hit me that she'd been doing this for at least 6 months, since before I even noticed symptoms. This wasn't a crime of passion but premeditated murder, slow and calculated and patient. She'd smiled at me every day while serving me poison, touched my hand across the table, called me Mom, and all the while she was killing me one cup at a time. The truth crushed down on me like a physical weight. My daughter-in-law was trying to murder me, the young woman I'd welcomed into my home, my family, my life. But why? For what? The house, the company, the money, and where did Trevor fit into this? Did he know? Was he part of it? I considered calling the police, screaming the truth to anyone who would listen. But something stopped me, because if I confronted Cassidy now without proof, she'd deny everything, lawyer up, and destroy evidence. I needed more than a toxicology report, needed proof of how she did it, needed to catch her in the act. So I made a decision that would change everything. I called no one and told no one what Dr. Shepard had revealed. When the police came to take my statement, I said I had no idea how the poison got into my system. I played the confused, frightened old woman, and I was frightened, but I wasn't confused anymore. My mind was clearer than it had been in months, sharp and focused with rage and purpose. Cassidy thought she was killing a helpless widow, but she had no idea who she was dealing with. I'd built a multi-million-dollar company from nothing, survived 40 years in a male-dominated industry by being smarter, tougher, and more ruthless than everyone else in the room. Cassidy had made a fatal mistake by underestimating me. On my 4th day in the hospital, I checked myself out against medical advice. Max tried to convince me to come home with her, but I refused, telling her firmly I needed to go back to my own house. Trevor picked me up with Cassidy in the passenger seat, both wearing expressions of relief and concern that now looked like masks to me. Trevor said they were so glad I was okay, and Cassidy turned in her seat, reaching back to pat my knee while saying the house felt so empty without me. I smiled at her and said I was glad to be home, and I truly was, because now I knew what I was dealing with and could fight back. When we pulled into the driveway, Cassidy insisted on helping me inside, her arm around my waist like I was fragile china. She settled me into my chair by the window, fluffed the pillows, and told me softly to rest while she made everything better. Then she disappeared into the kitchen, and I heard the familiar sounds, the kettle filling, the stove igniting, cabinet doors opening and closing. 5 minutes later, she returned with my delicate porcelain teacup on the silver tray, steam rising from the amber liquid. Honey and lemon, the poison that had been killing me for 6 months. She said with a warm smile that this would help me feel better, handing me the cup and watching, waiting, measuring, focused, as I lifted it to my lips. I smiled back at her, my hand steady, my mind cold and clear, thanking her and telling her she was always so good to me. And I drank. But this time I knew exactly what I was swallowing, and this time I was ready. The first thing I did was order the cameras. Not from my regular Amazon account because Cassidy had access to that. Instead, I drove to the bank and opened a new account under my maiden name, something I hadn't used in 45 years. I got a prepaid credit card, then went to the library and ordered 4 wireless micro cameras small enough to hide in plain sight. Express shipping? They'd arrive in 2 days, and the librarian had no idea she was helping a woman gather evidence of her own attempted murder. Installing them was the hardest part, since I needed Cassidy out of the house long enough to hide 4 cameras without being discovered. Luck intervened on Tuesday morning when Cassidy announced she was going grocery shopping and to the gym, her usual 3-hour routine. She asked with such false concern if I'd be okay alone, and I made my voice weak and trembling, saying I'd just rest. I watched from the window as her car pulled out, then moved faster than I had in months. First camera went inside the decorative cookie jar on the kitchen counter, lens aimed at the stove and kettle. Second camera tucked behind books on the living room shelf, covering where Cassidy always served my tea. Third hidden in the corner of the pantry behind a basket. Fourth in the hallway angled toward the kitchen door. My hands shook as I synced them to my phone, and by the time Cassidy returned, I was back in my chair looking frail and drowsy. Then I began the hardest performance of my life, pretending to be sicker, weaker, more confused than I actually was. I shuffled when I walked, forgot names mid-sentence, asked the same questions twice, Every afternoon at 3 o'clock, I accepted Cassidy's tea with trembling hands, lifted it to my lips, and drank. But the moment she left the room, I poured the tea into mason jars I'd hidden in my bedroom, sealed them tight, and labeled them with dates. Each jar was proof. Each sip she thought I was taking was actually being preserved for the police. I flushed the toilet to cover the sound of pouring liquid, ran water in the sink, became an actress in my own home. I played the role of a dying woman while secretly documenting my murder, and the whole time rage burned cold and steady in my chest. She thought I was dying, and she was right, because the woman who trusted her was already dead. Cassidy grew bolder, and I saw it in the way she moved through the house now, more confident and less careful. She stopped bothering to hide her impatience when I asked her to repeat something, sighed when I moved too slowly on the stairs. One morning I heard her on the phone in the guest bedroom, not knowing I was standing in the hallway. She said it wouldn't be much longer, that I was deteriorating fast, that the forgetfulness and weakness were accelerating. A pause, then a laugh, sharp and cold, saying she should get an Oscar for this performance. Another pause, then she said by Christmas they'd have everything, the house, the company, all of it. My blood turned to ice, because she'd said we. Not I'll have everything, but we'll have everything. Who was she talking to, and what did it mean for my survival? That evening, I locked myself in my bedroom and opened the camera app on my phone with shaking hands. I scrolled back to that afternoon's footage, to 2:40 to 7, 13 minutes before she'd brought me my tea. There she was on my screen, in my kitchen, humming a cheerful tune while she filled the kettle with water. She waited for it to boil while checking her phone, completely relaxed, then reached into the cabinet above the stove and pulled out an unmarked plastic bottle. Clear liquid inside, and she unscrewed the cap, glanced toward the doorway checking if I was coming, then poured a careful measure into the teapot. 1, 2, 3 seconds before screwing the cap back on, returning the bottle to the cabinet, and stirring the tea with my favorite silver spoon. Then she arranged her face into an expression of loving concern and carried the tray toward my room. I watched this footage 3 times, unable to believe what I was seeing even though I'd known, because knowing and seeing are different things. I had to know about Trevor, whether my son was part of this or just tragically blind. I needed to understand even though part of me feared the answer, so I watched hours of footage, searching for evidence either way. I saw them together in the kitchen, laughing over wine, saw Trevor kiss Cassidy's forehead and call her amazing. But I never saw him near the tea, never saw him touch the poison, never heard him reference my death or the inheritance. He was either completely ignorant or an exceptional actor, but either way, he'd failed me. He'd brought a murderer into my home and refused to see the truth even when I'd tried to tell him something was wrong. Whether through malice or negligence, my son had chosen her over me, and that betrayal cut deeper than the poison ever could. The next day, when both Cassidy and Trevor went to the gym together, I moved with purpose. I went straight to the kitchen, pulled a chair over to the high cabinet, and climbed up despite my shaking legs. There it was, pushed behind a container of protein powder, an unmarked plastic bottle filled with clear liquid. My hands were steady as I photographed it from every angle, the label-less surface, the contents, the placement. Then I carefully opened it, and the chemical smell was unmistakable. Antifreeze, sweet deadly ethylene glycol, the same substance Dr. Shepard had found in my blood. I sealed it back up, returned it exactly as I'd found it, and climbed down. Then I went to the pantry, searching behind flour and sugar containers until I found the second bottle, with a faded label, rat poison, brodifacoum. She'd been alternating, how methodical, how careful, how absolutely monstrous. I photographed everything, the bottles in their hiding places, screenshots of the video footage showing Cassidy preparing my poison tea, the mason jars of saved tea each labeled and dated, bank statements showing unusual purchases from chemical supply stores, receipts in her purse for rubber gloves, syringes, large quantities of honey and lemon to mask the taste. I documented it all with the same meticulous attention to detail I'd used to build my company, creating an airtight, undeniable case that would send Cassidy to prison for the rest of her life. I uploaded everything to a secure cloud account with a password she'd never guess, George's birthday plus our wedding anniversary. Then I uploaded it again to a second account and a third because I wasn't taking any chances. That evening, Cassidy brought my tea as always, saying warmly she'd made it extra strong today because I needed my strength. The irony would have been funny if it wasn't so horrifying, as I smiled and reached for the cup with a slight tremor I no longer had to fake. I thanked her, calling her sweetheart and saying she was so good to me while she watched me lift the cup to my lips. I let the hot liquid touch my mouth, made a show of swallowing, even closed my eyes in appreciation and murmured it was perfect. Cassidy's smile widened, and she said she was so glad, then left probably to call her mysterious partner and report that I'd taken my dose like a good little victim. The moment her footsteps faded down the hallway, I poured the tea into a sealed mason jar and labeled it with the date and time. I stood in my bedroom, holding that jar of poison up to the light, watching the amber liquid glow in the lamplight. This was what trust looked like when it was weaponized, what family looked like when it wanted you dead, but I wasn't dead, and wouldn't be if I had anything to say about it. I needed to understand the full scope of what Cassidy was planning, because the poison was just the method, but what was the motive? Through a lawyer I'd worked with years ago, I got a referral for Warren Gibbs, a private investigator who specialized in insurance fraud. I contacted him from a burner phone I'd bought at a convenience store 3 towns over, telling him I needed him to look into my daughter-in-law quietly. Warren didn't ask why, just said to give him 72 hours. By Thursday, he called back with information that made my blood run cold, saying I needed to sit down for this. My daughter-in-law had taken out a life insurance policy on me 14 months ago for $4.5 million. The application had my signature, but he'd bet his license it was forged based on handwriting analysis showing inconsistencies. I asked who the beneficiary was, already knowing the answer but needing to hear it said aloud. Cassidy Brennan, only Cassidy, with my son not listed anywhere on the policy. There it was, the proof of premeditation showing she hadn't married Trevor and slowly decided to kill me, but had planned this from the beginning. The marriage, the move into my house, the daily tea ritual, all of it was part of a carefully constructed murder plot. I thanked Warren, paid his fee from my secret account, and asked him to send me everything he'd found. But Warren wasn't finished, saying someone had been draining my accounts in small amounts that wouldn't trigger fraud alerts. 500 here, 1,000 there, adding up to about $78,000 over 6 months. I pulled up my banking app with shaking hands and saw it for myself. Transfers I didn't authorize, checks written to cash I didn't sign. Cassidy had been stealing from me, while simultaneously poisoning me, taking my wealth while I was still alive. Then Warren told me about the house deed, that Cassidy had been making inquiries with estate lawyers about property transfer and expediting inheritance when someone is mentally declining. My house, the house George and I bought 40 years ago where we raised Trevor and where George died, she wanted that too. And she'd been working on Trevor, trying to convince him to pressure me into signing over the deed for tax purposes or estate planning. I had to confront Trevor, had to know if my son was part of this nightmare or just a pawn in Cassidy's game. I waited until Cassidy went to her yoga class and asked Trevor to come to my study, telling him to close the door. I spread the insurance policy documents across my desk like evidence at a crime scene and asked if he knew about this. My voice was steady and cold as Trevor picked up the papers, his eyes scanning the pages. I watched his face carefully, looking for any sign of guilt or prior knowledge, and what I saw was shock, genuine, complete shock. His face went pale as he asked what it was, his voice cracking, and I explained it was a $4.5 million life insurance policy on me that Cassidy had taken out with forged signature. She was the sole beneficiary, he wasn't even listed, and she'd been stealing from my bank accounts and poisoning my tea. Trevor's reaction was exactly what I'd feared: denial. Complete, willful, desperate denial. He said there had to be an explanation. Maybe she was trying to help with estate planning and didn't want to worry me. I cut him off, telling him I had toxicology reports showing antifreeze and rat poison in my blood. video footage of her putting it in my tea, the bottle she hides in the kitchen. This wasn't a misunderstanding, but attempted murder. Trevor shook his head, backing away from the desk, saying she wouldn't do this because she loved me and our family. Then he said he thought I was confused, that the doctors said I might be experiencing cognitive decline, and that's when I understood. He'd been prepared for this because Cassidy had been laying groundwork, telling him I was losing my mind, paranoid and confused. When the evidence finally came out, he'd already been conditioned to dismiss it. He said she loved me again, his voice pleading, insisting this had to be a mistake, maybe identity theft. I raised my hand to stop him and told him quietly but finally to get out of my study. Trevor stood there with the insurance policy still in his hands, looking lost, saying we should just talk to Cassidy because he was sure she could explain. That's when my heart broke completely, not because I thought he was part of the murder plot, but because he was so desperate to believe in his picture-perfect marriage. He was so unwilling to see the monster he'd brought into our home that he'd choose her word over mine, over documented evidence, over toxicology reports and video footage. I'd raised my son to protect the weak, to stand up for justice, to see truth even when it was ugly, and in the moment I needed him most, he failed every lesson I'd ever taught him by looking at me with something like pity. I told him to leave again and not tell Cassidy we had this conversation, but he thought I was a delusional old woman making up conspiracies because I was lonely or jealous or losing my mind. He set the documents back on my desk carefully like he was humoring a child, saying he wouldn't say anything but really thought I should talk to my doctor about these thoughts. He left, closing the door softly behind him, and I sat in my study for a long time staring at the insurance policy documents. I felt the full weight of my isolation because my husband was dead. My son had chosen his wife over me, and I was alone in this house with a woman trying to kill me. No one was coming to save me. So I made a decision that I couldn't rely on Trevor, couldn't rely on family loyalty or love or any of the things I'd spent my whole life believing in. I had to rely on the one thing that had never failed me, the law. I called Detective Sloane Harper's number, the card she'd left after taking my statement at the hospital, telling her I needed to meet and had evidence of attempted murder. There was a pause before she said she'd be there in an hour, and I spent that hour organizing everything. The video footage, the photographs of the poison bottles, the toxicology reports, the forged insurance policy, the bank statements showing theft, the mason jars of saved tea. I put it all on a flash drive and made 3 backup copies. When Detective Harper arrived, I handed her the drive and said simply this was everything she needed to arrest my daughter-in-law for attempted murder, insurance fraud, and financial exploitation. Detective Harper took the flash drive and sat down at my kitchen table with her laptop, and I watched her face as she reviewed the evidence. Her expression went from skeptical to serious to something like awe as she looked up at me with new respect, saying this was one of the most well-documented cases she'd ever seen. I smiled grimly and told her I didn't build a $47 million company by being sloppy with documentation. Harper nodded slowly, saying she needed to take this to the prosecutor, but based on what she was seeing, my daughter-in-law was going to prison for a very long time. As she prepared to leave, she paused at the door saying we should talk about protective measures because until they made an arrest, I was still in danger. I met her eyes steadily and told her I knew, but I wasn't running because this was my house. Let her try again, I said, because this time I'd be ready. Detective Sloane Harper moved fast, and by the next morning she'd brought the evidence to Prosecutor Rita Callahan. By afternoon, they were both sitting in my living room laying out their strategy, with Rita sharp and focused, saying the evidence was extraordinary, but she wanted to make it bulletproof. Defense attorneys would argue the videos were out of context, that the insurance policy was a misunderstanding, that I had cognitive issues affecting my judgment. She wanted to catch Cassidy in the act one more time, with police present, with multiple witnesses, something so undeniable that no jury could doubt it. Detective Harper nodded, saying they needed a confession or at minimum another clear attempt on my life documented in real time. That's when they told me about the wire, a recording device I'd wear hidden under my clothes capturing every conversation with Cassidy, They needed me to bait her, say something that would make her reveal her intentions, something about my will or estate planning that might provoke a response. My hands started shaking, not from fear of Cassidy anymore, but from the reality of having to sit across from my daughter-in-law knowing she was trying to kill me while discussing my death with a police wire pressed against my skin. Rita must have seen my fear because she reached across and squeezed my hand, saying I didn't have to do it because they had enough to arrest Cassidy now. But we both knew enough wasn't the same as undeniable, so I heard myself say I'd do it, my voice steadier than I felt. I told them I didn't survive poison to let her walk free on some technicality, and Detective Harper looked at me with admiration. They'd have officers positioned around my house, and if anything went wrong, I'd say the code word legacy and they'd come in. Cassidy came home from errands around 4 o'clock, carrying shopping bags and humming, looking so normal and innocently domestic. If I'd passed her on the street, I'd have thought she was someone's beloved daughter, not a murderer who'd spent 14 months orchestrating an elderly woman's death. The wire was pressed against my sternum as I told her I'd been thinking about my will, about estate planning, saying it was time to update everything. Cassidy's smile didn't falter, but something shifted in her eyes and sharpened as she sat across from me, asking what brought this on. I said I wasn't getting any younger and wanted to make sure Trevor was taken care of, thinking of leaving everything to him. I watched Cassidy's face carefully as her smile tightened almost imperceptibly, a small muscle in her jaw twitching. She suggested slowly that since she and Trevor were partners now, maybe I should consider leaving it to both of them, or putting it in a trust. She was trying to steer the conversation toward her advantage, but I saw frustration and impatience in her expression, the look of someone who'd been waiting too long for something they believed was rightfully theirs. That's when Cassidy made her mistake, leaning back with a casual shrug that was anything but casual, saying why bother because I wouldn't be around much longer anyway. The words hung in the air between us. Then she seemed to realize what she'd said and laughed quickly, artificially. She added that at my age with my health issues, we should probably expedite the legal work while I was still capable. She'd tried to soften it, make it sound like concern rather than a threat, but it was too late because the wire had captured every word. I forced myself to smile back, to act like I hadn't heard the death sentence in her words, saying she was probably right. Cassidy relaxed, probably thinking she'd covered her slip adequately, then offered to make me some tea, saying I looked tired. There it was, the daily ritual, the poisoned kindness, and I watched her through the doorway as she went through all the familiar motions. But this time the cameras were recording every second. Detective Harper and her team were watching the live feed from a van 2 blocks away. And when Cassidy reached up to that high cabinet and pulled down the unmarked bottle, there were witnesses. She set the cup in front of me, saying this would help me feel better, thinking I was fragile, not knowing fragile things can still cut. I lifted the cup to my lips with steam rising between us like a barrier while Cassidy watched with that familiar, focused intensity. But what she didn't know was that this cup of tea wasn't just poisoning me, but poisoning her entire defense, because every second she watched me drink was another second of evidence. I pretended to take a small sip and grimaced slightly, saying it tasted different, more bitter than usual. Cassidy's eyes flickered and she laughed it off, saying maybe she'd steeped it too long, telling me just to drink it because it was good for me. There, another damning statement captured on the wire as I set the cup down, claiming I needed to use the bathroom. The moment I was out of sight, I poured it down the sink with evidence secured, one final jar labeled and sealed for the prosecution. The arrest happened at dawn the next morning while I sat by my bedroom window watching the street turn from black to gray to pale gold. I heard cars pull up quietly with no sirens, just soft crunches of tires on the driveway, then footsteps on the porch and the doorbell. Trevor's confused voice asking who it was, then the formal, emotionless response that police had a warrant for the arrest of Cassidy Brennan. I heard Cassidy's voice next, high and sharp with panic, saying this was insane. Then Detective Harper's calm, professional tone reading her rights for attempted murder, insurance fraud, and financial exploitation. Cassidy screamed, actually screamed, her voice shrill and desperate, calling me a senile old woman who was making things up, saying I was crazy, but the handcuffs were already clicking into place, and I watched from my bedroom window as they led her out. She was still in her bathrobe with uncombed hair and her face twisted with rage and fear, not the beautiful, composed daughter-in-law who'd smiled at me over tea. This was the real Cassidy, desperate and cruel and cornered, and when she looked up at my window and our eyes met, I smiled. A small, cold smile that said everything. I know what you did. I documented everything, and now you're going to pay. Detective Harper put a hand on Cassidy's head, guiding her into the police car, and through the window I could still see her screaming silently behind glass. In the doorway of my house stood Trevor, frozen and watching his wife being arrested, his face blank with shock. He didn't look up at my window or at me, just stood there as his perfect life collapsed around him. As the police cars pulled away, Detective Harper came to my door saying they had her and there was something else I should know. Cassidy Brennan wasn't her real name but Cassidy Winters, and she'd done this before in Arizona, to an elderly aunt who'd taken her in. The woman died before anyone suspected poisoning. Cassidy collected a $200,000 inheritance and disappeared, and they'd been looking for her for 3 years. So I wasn't even her first victim, just the next lonely widow, the next trusting family member, the next obstacle to be slowly eliminated, but I was also the first one who fought back. Trevor came to me that evening after Cassidy had been escorted out with his eyes red-rimmed and desperate, begging me to drop the charges. His voice cracked on the last word as I stared at this man I'd raised and barely recognized him, asking if he seriously expected me to drop charges against someone who tried to murder me. Trevor shook his head frantically, saying she was under stress, that people make mistakes when they're overwhelmed, and he called attempted murder a mistake. I told him to get out of my house, but he said she was his wife and he loved her. And there it was, the final betrayal. As I told him, he'd made his choice and it wasn't me. The media found the story within days with my face on every local news channel alongside Cassidy's mugshot. Reporters camped outside my house for weeks wanting interviews and statements, but I gave them nothing. Social media erupted with opinions, some calling me brave, others suggesting I was making it up, but I stopped reading because the only opinions that mattered would come from a jury. Cassidy's attorney Blake Mitchell launched a defense strategy arguing I was mentally unstable, that my age and recent health issues had made me paranoid and delusional. He claimed I'd fabricated evidence, that the videos were edited, that the toxicology reports were contaminated, telling reporters his client was the victim of a vindictive woman who couldn't accept her son's marriage. I watched his press conference and felt nothing. No anger or indignation, just cold certainty that he'd fail because you can't argue with video footage or explain away forged signatures and stolen money. Prosecutor Rita Callahan prepared me for testimony with the intensity of a general preparing for war, warning me they'd try to break me on the stand. They'd question my memory, my judgment, my motives, paint me as a jealous mother-in-law who couldn't let Trevor go. I sat across from her with my hands folded in my lap and said quietly that I didn't survive poison to be intimidated by questions. Rita smiled with professional respect, saying I was the strongest witness she'd ever worked with. Dr. Nicole Shepard's toxicology report became the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. 43 pages of detailed analysis proving multiple poisons in my system over months. Rita said defense could question my motives, my memory, even my mental state, but they couldn't question chemistry or argue with molecules and blood serum levels. The report showed exactly what Cassidy had done, started with small doses of antifreeze gradually increasing over time, then added rat poison to accelerate the process, creating a death that would look like natural organ failure in an elderly woman. The day the trial began, I dressed carefully in a navy blue suit with pearls George had given me for our 30th anniversary. I looked like what I was, a successful businesswoman, a respected community member, a credible witness, not a confused elderly woman making up conspiracies. Maxine drove me to the courthouse because I didn't trust myself behind the wheel, not from fear but from rage. As we pulled up, I saw protesters holding signs saying, "Justice for Dorothy and elder abuse equals murder," some from my church, some from the community center, some strangers who decided this mattered. Walking up those courthouse steps was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Each step feeling symbolic. A public declaration that private betrayal had become public justice. At the top, Detective Harper was waiting, asking if I was ready, and I nodded, saying I'd been ready since the moment I realized what Cassidy was doing. Harper held the door open, and I walked through into the cold, sterile, impersonal courthouse, exactly what I needed. This wasn't about emotion anymore, but about evidence, testimony, and the weight of truth. I'd spent weeks preparing for this moment, and now it was time to make Cassidy answer for what she'd done, not just to me, but to that woman in Arizona, to every elderly person who'd ever been betrayed by someone they trusted. This wasn't revenge, but accountability. And as I took my seat in the courtroom and saw Cassidy sitting at the defense table refusing to look at me, I felt something settle inside me. She thought she could kill me slowly and take everything I'd built, but she'd underestimated who she was dealing with. Now 12 strangers would hear my story, see the evidence I'd gathered, and decide her fate. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Cramped and practical with fluorescent lights and worn carpet, not the grand dramatic space from movies. But the jury box was real, 12 strangers who would decide whether Cassidy spent the rest of her life in prison. I sat in the front row behind the prosecution table, exactly where Rita had told me to sit, visible and present, a living reminder of what Cassidy had tried to do. When they brought Cassidy in wearing a modest gray dress with minimal makeup and her hair pulled back, the defense team had clearly coached her appearance to look sympathetic and harmless, but I saw her trembling hands. Rita Callahan's opening statement was surgical as she stood before the jury with the confidence of someone who knew she held all the cards. She said this wasn't a crime of passion but premeditated murder disguised as caregiving, explaining how over 14 months Cassidy systematically poisoned me using antifreeze and rat poison. She forged a $4.5 million life insurance policy, stole from my bank accounts, and planned every detail of my death while smiling over cups of poisoned tea. Rita paused, letting that image sink in, saying Cassidy thought she'd get away with it, thought no one would notice, thought I would simply die quietly and naturally so she could inherit everything. Blake Mitchell's opening was more desperate as he stood up and tried to paint me as the villain, a bitter, lonely woman who couldn't accept her son's marriage. He claimed I saw Cassidy as a threat, a young, beautiful woman who had won my son's love and attention, so I fabricated a conspiracy. He said I took health problems that were the natural result of aging and turned them into evidence of attempted murder, gesturing toward Cassidy, who sat with her head down trying to look small and victimized. He claimed she was guilty of nothing but loving her husband and trying to help me, that she prepared tea as an act of kindness, and suggested estate planning as an act of responsibility. When Rita called me to the stand, I walked calmly to the witness box with steady hands as I placed them on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. I looked out at the courtroom, at the jury, at Rita, at Detective Harper in the back row, and then deliberately at Cassidy, who was staring at the table refusing to meet my eyes. Rita started with simple questions establishing that I was competent, credible, and sharp, then moved to the substance, asking me to tell the jury when I first met Cassidy. I took a breath and began, telling them everything: the first dinner, the wedding, the decision to let them move in, the daily tea ritual, the first symptoms, the hospital visit, the toxicology report. Blake's cross-examination was aggressive but ineffective as he asked if I resented my son's marriage, if I had a history of paranoia, if I was simply experiencing normal aging symptoms. I looked at him evenly and answered each question calmly, saying I welcomed Cassidy into my home, that I had a history of building a successful company through careful attention to detail and evidence. When he suggested I might have misinterpreted normal aging symptoms, I smiled slightly and said antifreeze and rat poison in my bloodstream wasn't a misinterpretation but chemistry. The jury actually smiled at that, and Blake grew flustered, asked a few more questions, then gave up because there was nothing to shake. Then Rita played the video and the courtroom went silent as the screen lit up with footage from my hidden camera. We watched Cassidy in my kitchen humming cheerfully, filling the kettle, then reaching up to that high cabinet and pulling out the unmarked bottle. She poured the clear liquid into the teapot, stirred carefully, checked the doorway to make sure no one was watching, then arranged her face into an expression of loving concern and carried the poisoned tea toward my room. When the video ended, the silence was deafening, with someone in the gallery gasping and a juror covering her mouth while Cassidy sat frozen, her face completely white. Trevor's testimony was heartbreaking as he took the stand looking 10 years older, his suit hanging loose on a frame that had lost weight. Rita was gentle with him, recognizing he was a victim, too, of manipulation, of lies, of his own willful blindness, asking if he noticed my health declining and if he took those concerns seriously. His voice was barely above a whisper as he said yes, then admitted he thought I was just getting older, that he thought his wife loved us, that he ignored the warning signs because he didn't want to believe what they meant. When Blake stood up to cross-examine, Trevor looked at him and said he had nothing to say, that his wife tried to murder his mother, that he was blind and stupid but wasn't part of it. Warren Gibbs presented the financial evidence with the dry precision of an expert witness, explaining how he'd discovered the forged life insurance policy, tracked the stolen funds, and uncovered Cassidy's real identity. He testified that Cassidy Winters committed a nearly identical crime in Arizona in 2019, befriending an elderly aunt, moving in to care for her, and slowly poisoning her. The woman died and Cassidy inherited $200,000, and by the time anyone suspected foul play, she had changed her name and disappeared. The jury's faces showed shock and disgust, because this wasn't a one-time mistake but a pattern, a predator who targeted vulnerable elderly women, earned their trust, and murdered them for money. Dr. Nicole Shepard's testimony sealed Cassidy's fate as she explained the toxicology results in terms even a layperson could understand. She said I had ethylene glycol and brodifacoum in my system, at levels consistent with repeated intentional exposure over approximately 6 months, that these weren't substances you accidentally ingest. Blake tried to challenge the science, but Nicole was unshakable with decades of experience and peer-reviewed credentials, stating plainly that the levels found were lethal over time. She said if I hadn't stopped drinking the tea when I did, I would have died within weeks, that this was murder in slow motion, and the courtroom was silent. I watched Cassidy throughout all of this, looking for remorse, for grief, for any human emotion, but her face remained blank and stone-like, as if she'd retreated somewhere deep inside herself. I wanted her to feel what I felt, helpless and betrayed and alone, but sitting there, watching her refuse to engage with her own crimes, I realized something. She never cared enough to feel anything because I was never a person to her, just an obstacle, a means to an end, and you can't betray someone you never valued in the first place. Cassidy had murdered before and would have murdered again if I hadn't stopped her. Not a person who made a terrible mistake, but a predator who got caught. Blake Mitchell called no witnesses for the defense, because what could he say when the video was damning? The toxicology was irrefutable, and the pattern of prior fraud was established. Even Cassidy's own mother, called by the prosecution as a rebuttal witness, testified that her daughter always had a terrible temper and was obsessed with money from a young age. Blake made a half-hearted closing argument about reasonable doubt and the burden of proof, but his heart wasn't in it. After closing arguments and jury instructions, the jury filed out to deliberate while Rita touched my shoulder, saying I did everything right and should be proud whatever happened. The jury deliberated for 4 hours while I sat on a wooden bench in the courthouse hallway, with Maxine holding my hand without speaking. Rita had warned me that a quick verdict usually favored the prosecution, since jurors who saw clear guilt didn't waste time debating, but 4 hours felt like an eternity. Every minute that passed, I wondered what they were discussing, whether they were reviewing the video evidence or arguing about reasonable doubt or simply going through the formality of voting on each count. My hands were steady, but my heart raced, because this was the moment that would determine whether Cassidy paid for what she'd done or whether some technicality would set her free. Trevor appeared in the hallway like a ghost, having sat on the opposite side of the courtroom during the trial as far from me as possible. But now he approached slowly, with his face streaked with tears and his expensive suit rumpled, saying he was so sorry he didn't believe me, that he should have protected me and should have seen what she was doing. He collapsed onto the bench beside me, sobbing like a child, and part of me wanted to hold him and comfort him the way I had when he was small. But another part, the part that had lain on a bathroom floor poisoned and alone while he slept, remained cold as I said quietly that I forgave him, but would never forget. The bailiff appeared in the doorway, saying the jury was back, and those 2 words sent electricity through the hallway as everyone stood at once. We filed back into the courtroom in tense silence, with Cassidy already seated at the defense table, her face pale and expressionless, while Blake Mitchell looked resigned. The jury filed in with none of them looking at Cassidy, which Rita had told me was a good sign since jurors who've convicted someone can't make eye contact with the defendant. I held my breath as the judge addressed the forewoman, asking if the jury had reached a verdict, and the forewoman stood saying they had. The judge asked how they found on the count of attempted murder in the 1st degree, and the courtroom was silent as the forewoman said guilty. The word hung in the air like thunder, while I felt something crack open in my chest. Not joy, but relief and vindication. Guilty on insurance fraud, guilty on elder abuse, guilty on financial exploitation of an elderly person. 4 counts and 4 guilty verdicts as I watched Cassidy's face remain stone-faced through the first 3. But something inside her snapped on the 4th. She stood up, knocking her chair backward with a crash, screaming that this was bullshit and I was lying, that the crazy old bitch fabricated everything. The courtroom erupted as the judge banged her gavel, ordering the bailiff to restrain the defendant, but Cassidy was in full meltdown with all pretense of the sweet daughter-in-law gone. She screamed that we were all idiots and I had manipulated everyone, that she hoped I died and rotted in that house alone, but the bailiffs grabbed her arms and dragged her through the side door. Her voice echoed down the hallway even after she disappeared, and then someone in the gallery started clapping, then another, and within seconds half the courtroom was applauding. Sentencing came 2 weeks later, with Cassidy appearing in an orange jumpsuit, her hair lank and unwashed with dark circles under her eyes, looking nothing like the polished woman who'd served me tea. The judge reviewed the case with careful deliberation, then looked directly at Cassidy, calling her by her real name, Ms. Winters, because she'd proven herself to be someone who lives under false pretenses. The judge said her actions were calculated, cruel, and unforgivable, that she preyed on a vulnerable widow who welcomed her into her home and family, poisoning her daily while planning her death with methodical patience. The judge noted this was not her first offense, and she would do it again, then sentenced her to 25 years to life in state prison with parole eligibility at age 73. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed like locusts with microphones thrust toward my face, cameras flashing, voices overlapping with questions about the verdict and what I wanted to say to other elderly people. I stood on the courthouse steps with Rita's hand on my elbow, ready to pull me away if needed, but I had something to say. I looked at the sea of faces and said simply that justice was served today. That was all I had to say, short and simple and final. I turned and walked down the steps, ignoring the follow-up questions shouted at my back because I'd said everything that mattered in that courtroom under oath. Trevor filed for divorce 3 days after sentencing, and I learned about it from Detective Harper, who'd been copied on the paperwork because of the criminal case. He listed irreconcilable differences and cited her criminal conviction, and I thanked Harper and hung up, then sat in my study trying to feel something about it. The marriage had been a lie from the beginning, since Cassidy never loved Trevor. He was just a vehicle to access me and my money and my assets. What hurt more was that Trevor moved out the following weekend, coming when I wasn't home to pack his belongings and leave without saying goodbye, and I returned to find his room empty with his key on the kitchen counter and a note saying he couldn't stay there. Cassidy was transferred to a maximum security women's prison upstate within the month, and I received official notification from the Department of Corrections. As the victim, I had the right to be notified of her location, her parole hearings, and any changes to her incarceration status. I filed the paperwork in a folder labeled Legal Cassidy Winters and put it in my filing cabinet, out of sight but not forgotten. I needed to know where she was, that she was contained, that she couldn't hurt anyone else. Rita called me after the transfer saying it was over, that Cassidy was locked up, and I was safe now. But was I really safe from Cassidy? Yes, but safe from the memories, from the nightmares about drinking poison tea, from the paranoia that made me triple-check every lock on my doors. That kind of safety takes longer to find, and I returned home alone and walked through my house room by room, the house I'd lived in for 40 years, the house George and I had bought with our first big contract, the house where we'd raised Trevor and celebrated holidays and built a life. I walked into the kitchen and saw it sitting there on the counter where I'd left it that morning. The delicate porcelain teacup George had given me as a wedding gift. Empty now, clean, innocent, just a cup. But looking at it, I saw months of poison, of trust weaponized, of kindness disguised as murder. I picked it up carefully and placed it in the cabinet, closing the door, not throwing it away but knowing I'd never drink from it again. That night, Rita called with news that made my stomach drop, saying Cassidy had filed an appeal claiming inadequate defense and arguing that Blake Mitchell didn't provide effective counsel. I closed my eyes exhausted and asked if she could win. And Rita's voice was firm, saying not a chance because Blake did everything he could with an unwinnable case. But these things take time, months or maybe years, and she was exercising her legal right to appeal. So it wasn't over, not really. And Cassidy would fight from her prison cell, filing motions and appeals, trying every legal trick to overturn her conviction. 6 months passed like water through fingers as I settled into a new routine. One that didn't include afternoon tea or family dinners or the sound of voices other than my own. I sold my shares in the company to the management team I'd trained, officially retiring at 69, and the money went into a trust I'd set up with an estate lawyer. With my time freed up, I started volunteering at the senior center downtown twice a week, teaching a class called Protecting Yourself from Financial Abuse. 15 elderly people showed up to the first session, but by the third month we had to move to a larger room to accommodate 50. I told them my story, not for sympathy but as a warning, saying it can happen to anyone, especially to those of us who've been successful and built something worth stealing. Trust but verify, always verify, I told them, and I saw recognition in their faces, understanding that vulnerability doesn't discriminate. Maxine remained my anchor, appearing at my door every Tuesday and Thursday like clockwork with coffee and whatever gossip she'd collected from the neighborhood. We'd sit in my living room, the same room where Cassidy used to serve me poisoned tea, and talk about everything except Cassidy. One afternoon I thanked her for staying, for not abandoning me when the media circus was at its worst, when association with me meant association with scandal. Max looked at me like I'd said something absurd, saying we buried our husbands together, raised our kids together, asking if I thought she'd leave me alone after I survived attempted murder. She said it with a laugh, but I saw the fierce loyalty underneath, knowing some friendships are forged in fire, and ours had been forged in grief and survival. Trevor sent birthday cards and Christmas cards, generic greeting cards with generic messages saying he was thinking of me and hoping I was well. No phone calls, no visits, no real reconciliation because the wound was too deep, the betrayal too complex. He'd chosen Cassidy over me when it mattered. And even though he'd been manipulated and eventually divorced her, the fact remained, when I needed him to believe me, to protect me, to stand with me, he hadn't. I kept the cards in a drawer, unable to throw them away but unwilling to display them, representing something broken that would never fully heal. Constance became an unexpected source of strength, visiting weekly with practical offerings like casseroles, garden vegetables, and books she thought I'd like. She told me one day that I saved my own life, that I could have been another victim who died mysteriously with no one questioning it. But I fought back. She said that takes a kind of strength most people don't have, and I should be proud, but I told her I didn't feel proud, just tired. She said good, that it meant I was human, that if I felt proud about this whole nightmare, she'd be worried. I spent a lot of time looking at old photographs from before Cassidy, before the poison, before the trial. George and me on our 20th anniversary standing in front of the house we'd just finished renovating. Trevor as a baby, and then a teenager, and then a man in his college graduation gown. The three of us at Christmas and Thanksgiving and ordinary Tuesday dinners, looking happy, because we were happy, and that was real. The memories weren't poisoned just because the ending was tragic, and I had to remind myself of that on hard days. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in a plain white envelope with a prison return address. My name, written in handwriting, I recognized immediately as Cassidy's. My hands shook as I held it, debating whether to open it, wondering if it was an apology or a threat or a manipulation attempt. I stood in my kitchen thinking about what I owed her, whether I owed her my attention, my forgiveness, the chance to explain or apologize or whatever she wanted this letter to accomplish. No, I owed her nothing because she'd taken enough from me, my health, my peace of mind, my family, my sense of safety in my own home. I walked to the fireplace, struck a match, and held the flame to the corner of the envelope, watching it catch immediately and curl black and turn to ash. I watched it burn completely without reading a single word, because some doors you close and lock, but this one I burned to ground. My will needed updating, since the old version left everything to Trevor with provisions for grandchildren, assuming family loyalty and that blood meant something unbreakable. I knew better now, and met with my estate attorney to draft a new will. The house would go to a nonprofit that provided housing for elderly women escaping abuse, and the company proceeds and my investment portfolio would fund scholarships for women entrepreneurs. My personal possessions would go to Maxine and Constance and a few other friends, while Trevor got nothing. My attorney asked gently if I was sure about this since he was still my son, but I looked at him steadily and said he chose her over me. When I was being poisoned and begged him to see what was happening, he called me confused and paranoid and chose to believe a murderer over his own mother. One afternoon, I made myself a cup of tea, not with the porcelain cup that stayed in the cabinet as a relic of a different life, but with a simple blue mug Maxine had given me. I filled the kettle myself, chose the tea myself, steeped it myself with no one else's hands touching it, then sat in my chair by the window and sipped slowly. I tasted only tea, honey, and lemon just the way I liked it, and it was just tea, not poison or betrayal, just a warm drink on a cool afternoon. Such a simple thing, such an ordinary pleasure, but after everything it felt like reclaiming sacred ground. People ask if I regret what I did, if I regret prosecuting Cassidy, destroying my relationship with Trevor, turning my private trauma into public spectacle. I don't regret it because she chose to poison me and I chose to survive, and those were our choices that we both have to live with the consequences of. The house feels different now, quieter and emptier, but also more honestly mine, with no one pretending to care, no one watching me with clinical focus, no one plotting my death while smiling over breakfast. I water George's roses, attend my senior center workshops, have coffee with Maxine, read books and watch movies, and sometimes on good days I laugh. Not the loud carefree laughter of before, but something quieter, something earned. I didn't get my happy ending since my husband is still dead, my son is still distant, and my daughter-in-law is in prison for trying to murder me. But I got my life back, I got justice, I got to stand in a courtroom and say this happened to me, and it was wrong, and here's the proof. Tonight, I'll lock the front door with all 3 locks, the habit of someone who's learned not to feel safe easily, then turn off the lights downstairs and walk up to my bedroom. As I pass through the kitchen, I'll glance at the table where we used to eat dinner together with 3 chairs around it. George's chair has been empty for 4 years, and I've made my peace with that absence, while Trevor's chair is empty now too, and that grief is fresher and sharper. But the 3rd chair, Cassidy's chair, that emptiness is different because that's not grief, but relief. That chair will stay empty forever, and I'm glad because it's a reminder of what I survived, what I overcame, what I refused to accept as my fate. Some absences are blessings, and some empty chairs are victories, and I survived and won. Every morning I wake up in this house safe and whole and alive is proof that she failed, and that has to be enough. The truth is, I've been writing this all down, every detail, every moment, every emotion, a book about my experience and how I survived. I'm calling it the poison tea, not for money or fame since I have enough money and fame means nothing to me, but because someone needs to tell this story. Someone needs to warn others that predators like Cassidy exist, that they're smart and patient and convincing, that they target the vulnerable and the lonely and the trusting. They hide behind smiles and acts of kindness while planning murder. And if my story saves even one person from experiencing what I did, then everything will have meant something. This is my confession, my warning, my legacy. And the story you've just heard is real, every word of it. It happened to me and it could happen to you, so I'm telling it. Not for revenge or catharsis, but because silence protects predators. I refuse to be silent, and this is my story, and now it's yours too.